I've seen a lot in my years as a psychiatric nurse. You become used to the abnormal, the bizarre, and the unimaginable when you work in a place where reality itself often feels like a fragile, shifting concept. But there's one case that still lingers in my mind, one patient I'll never forget, no matter how many years pass. It was supposed to be just another night shift, like any other. The usual blend of exhaustion, caffeine, and routine tasks that make up the days and nights of a psychiatric nurse. I've learned not to expect too much excitement, not to anticipate anything more than what the charts tell me. But sometimes, there are moments that don't fit, moments that can't be explained away, no matter how hard you try. This was one of those moments. Her name was Mary, not a name I'll ever forget, but not one that I say aloud much anymore. She came to our ward at the beginning of the winter. We had received an emergency intake late in the evening. She was in her 30s, slender, with long, dark hair that fell over her face in an almost haunting way. At first glance, she seemed nothing more than another patient suffering from severe depression and anxiety, a case we saw too often. But then something happened. Mary's arrival had a peculiar air to it. The staff all felt it, though no one said anything out loud at first. It wasn't something anyone could explain. She didn't act out. She didn't shout or cry. She didn't even seem all that upset, no more than the usual patient admitted to the ward for a breakdown. She was calm, eerily so, which made everyone uneasy in a way we couldn't fully express. I'll admit, it was my instinct to stay cautious. There's something about being around that kind of quiet. It draws you in. You want to figure it out. You want to understand why someone seems so still, so utterly disconnected. But there was something in her eyes, the way she looked past me, past everyone, like she could see through us, that unsettled me. It wasn't long before I realized that Mary wasn't like the other patients. Something was different about her. Not just her detached behavior, but the atmosphere around her. You could feel the weight in the room, like the air was thicker when she was near, like the walls themselves knew she wasn't supposed to be here. The other nurses would joke about it, saying that we were imagining things, that it was just a bad night or the lingering effects of a long shift. But I've been in this job long enough to trust my instincts, and they were telling me to stay away from her, but that wasn't possible. I was her primary nurse, and my job was to keep her stable, to keep the unit running smoothly. The first incident happened during a routine check. I entered her room as part of my rounds, just like I'd done 100 times before with other patients. She was sitting on the bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring out the window. The room was dark, the lights low, just how she liked it. But when I entered, something changed. The air shifted. It was subtle at first, but I could feel it, a thickening of the space between us, as though she was drawing something out of me without even trying. "Mary?" I asked, my voice steady, as if I could pretend nothing was wrong. She didn't answer. Her eyes didn't even flicker. Her gaze was still fixed on the window, and it felt like she wasn't even aware of my presence. I walked closer, checked her vitals, adjusted her blanket. I told myself she was just lost in thought, lost in whatever turmoil she was enduring. But the silence was crushing. There was no sound but my breathing and the occasional rustle of the bedsheets. I turned to leave, feeling a sudden sense of urgency, as though something was urging me to get away. But then, just before I reached the door, she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it stopped me in my tracks. "You don't belong here either." The words were soft, but they cut through the air like a knife. I turned to face her, confusion tightening in my chest. "Mary," I said, my voice soft but firm. "It's okay. We're here to help you. This is a safe place." But she just smiled a smile that wasn't right. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't kind. It was cold, empty. It made my skin crawl. Then, before I could respond, she turned back to the window, her gaze once again distant, as if she'd never spoken at all. I left the room with a feeling that clung to me like a shadow, a feeling I couldn't shake. The rest of my shift passed in a haze, my thoughts lingering on Mary and her cryptic words. Something wasn't right. I knew that much. But what? I couldn't say. The next night, I was back on shift, and once again, I was assigned to Mary. There was a new sense of dread in the air as I walked into her room. The same heaviness, but now it was amplified. I didn't know why, but I felt like I was walking into a trap. The air was thick with something unsaid, something waiting. This time she wasn't sitting quietly on the bed. She was standing, her back to the door, her body rigid. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was very wrong. I called out her name, but she didn't respond. I stepped inside cautiously, feeling like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be seeing. And then I saw it, her reflection in the window. It wasn't her. Not entirely. The face staring back at me was twisted, pale, and unfamiliar. The eyes were black, empty voids that seemed to swallow every bit of light that fell upon them. The smile was stretched too wide, too unnaturally wide. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that this was no longer just a mental illness at play. This was something else, something that had no place in the world of medicine or diagnosis. I froze. I didn't know what to do. It was like time itself had stopped, and I was trapped in that single moment. The reflection blinked once, twice, and then turned its head slowly toward me. "You're going to help me," it whispered, the voice a strange mix of Mary's and something darker, something ancient. I felt the floor beneath me shift. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I turned to look at the real Mary, but she hadn't moved. She was still standing with her back to me, just as she had been before. But the reflection in the window, it was waiting for me. I was paralyzed with fear. The voice in my head was screaming at me to leave, to run, but I couldn't. My feet were glued to the floor, my body frozen in place. Then, the reflection spoke again, its voice clear and cold, its smile widening. "Help me, and I'll show you what's behind the door." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a promise. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't know if I could trust it. But I knew, deep down, that this was just the beginning of something much worse. And that's when I understood. It wasn't just Mary who was trapped in that room. It was me, too. As the words hung in the air, I felt the oppressive weight of the room close in around me. The strange reflection in the window, its eyes, black and hollow, lingered like a shadow just behind my vision. I should have run. I knew that. My body screamed at me to leave, to get out, but I couldn't. Something deeper, something I didn't fully understand, rooted me to the spot. I turned my eyes back to Mary. She was still standing there, unblinking, her back to me, as if she hadn't just spoken, or rather, as if something inside her had spoken in her place. I walked closer, cautiously, the hairs on my neck rising with every step I took. My breath felt heavier now, suffocating in the space between us. "Mary," I said, trying to steady my voice, but the tremor in it betrayed me. "What's going on?" She didn't respond. Instead, the room seemed to contract, pulling the walls inward, and a low, almost imperceptible hum began to vibrate in the air. It was a sound so faint, it could bend the buzz of a faulty light or the pulse of my own heartbeat if it weren't so wrong. The hum was steady, rhythmic, and it filled the room with a feeling that I couldn't shake, a feeling like something was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. And then, it happened. Out of nowhere, the temperature dropped, a sudden chill that crawled up my spine and froze my skin. It felt like winter had swept in, despite the heater running full blast, despite the warmth of the room. A gust of cold air rushed past me, almost like a breath, cold, damp, and unnatural. It left me with the feeling of being touched by something not human. The reflection in the window flickered, shifting, almost as though it was trying to detach itself from the glass. The face twisted and contorted in ways that defied the laws of nature, stretching beyond what should have been possible. And then, without warning, it smiled wide, far too wide, like it had all the time in the world to show me just how wrong it could be. "Help me, and I'll show you what's behind the door," it said again, this time with a tone that was almost coaxing, almost sweet. But the warmth in its voice was suffocating, dangerous. My mind was racing. What door? What was it talking about? The door. I remembered the door, the one Mary had been staring at. It had been in the corner of the room, barely noticeable at first, a faded wooden door with a tarnished doorknob that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. But now, as I looked at it, the door seemed more prominent, more real, like it was calling me. The closer I got to it, the more my instincts screamed at me to turn around, to leave. But the reflection in the window wouldn't let me. It stared at me, waiting, daring me to cross the line. "Mary," I whispered, my voice trembling, "what's behind the door?" Her response was chilling in its silence. I couldn't wait any longer. I took a step toward the door, the cold air wrapping tighter around me, constricting, choking me with every breath I took. As my fingers brushed the doorknob, I felt a pulse of energy, sharp electric hand. My body involuntarily jerked back. I stumbled, my heart pounding in my chest. But the door, it was still there, waiting. The reflection in the window smiled again, its expression stretching impossibly wide, and then it whispered, "Do you want to know? Do you want to see what happens when you open it?" The words slipped into my mind like oil, dark and thick, suffocating my thoughts. It wasn't just a question. It was a command, a choice I had to make. But I wasn't ready. I wasn't prepared for this. None of us are when we're faced with something we can't understand, something that lies beyond the veil of the ordinary world we've been trained to navigate. I backed away, my heart hammering, my hands shaking, but Mary was still standing by the window, unmoving, her gaze fixed on nothing. The reflection, though it didn't stop, it never stopped. It was watching me, waiting for me to take the step that would seal my fate. "You're afraid," the reflection whispered, its voice growing deeper, more sinister. "That's why you're not opening the door, because you know what's behind it. You already know." I spun around, looking at Mary again, but her face, it had changed. The calmness was gone, replaced by something darker, something deeper. Her eyes, once so empty, now glowed with a faint, unsettling light. She was staring at me, and I felt like she was seeing me, really seeing me, as if she knew everything I was hiding, everything I had ever feared. I stepped back, my heart racing. This wasn't just a psychiatric case. This wasn't a simple breakdown or psychosis. This was something else, something that didn't belong in this world. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I need to know what's going on." For a moment, nothing happened. Then with a slow, deliberate movement, Mary turned her head toward me. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I felt the world tilt. I wasn't looking at her anymore. I wasn't looking at a patient. I was looking at something ancient, something that had lived long before I was born, something that had seen everything and was waiting for me to understand. And then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was low, almost a hiss. "You want to know what's behind the door. You want to understand why you can't leave. You already are." The weight of her words hit me like a freight train. I stumbled back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My mind was racing, but I couldn't make sense of it. It didn't make sense. None of it did. And yet, in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I realized that I had been standing at the edge of something much darker than I could have imagined. And now, it had me in its grip. The door. I was the one who had opened it. Before I could react, the room around me shifted. The walls seemed to close in, the light flickered and died. And the sound, oh God, the sound, it was overwhelming. A low, guttural hum, like a million whispers at once, all speaking the same word, over and over. It was the word that made my skin crawl, the word that had been hanging in the air since I first walked into this room. Stay. And in that moment, I knew it was too late. There was no escaping this place, no leaving. I was already part of it. The ward, the building, the darkness, it had already claimed me, and now, I was just another piece of its puzzle. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in that nightmare. Time lost its meaning. The world outside that room didn't matter anymore. All I knew was the door, the reflection, and the haunting, unending hum. And then, slowly, as though the world was starting to breathe again, I felt something brush against my cheek. It was cold, icy, and I turned just in time to see the door creak open. But I didn't need to see what was inside. I already knew. The reflection wasn't in the window anymore. It was standing behind me. The door swung open, and I felt a rush of cold air sweep over me like a living thing. My pulse quickened, the sound of my heartbeat thumping in my ears louder than the hum that still lingered in the room. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. My body was paralyzed in that space between curiosity and terror, caught between the need to understand and the primal instinct to run. The reflection behind me was still there, standing just beyond my shoulder. It wasn't Mary. Not anymore. It was something else. Something that wore her skin like a borrowed suit. The smile, it was wrong, too wide, too knowing, and the eyes, those black, empty eyes, were the only things that mattered in that moment. They stared into mine, and for the first time since I'd walked into this job, I truly felt the weight of something watching me, not just looking at me, but seeing into me, all the way down to the core of who I was. The cold air kept pressing closer, wrapping itself around my body, suffocating me. And then, the whisper came again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence. Something that filled the room, that spread through my veins, creeping into my mind like a poison. "You didn't think it would let you leave, did you?" The reflection's voice was soft, coaxing, like a lover's lullaby, but there was nothing gentle about it. It was laced with something darker, something more sinister. "You're part of it now. You're here to stay." I turned my head, but the reflection stayed in my peripheral vision. An unshakable presence that made it impossible to escape. It was like the room was shrinking, like it was folding in on itself, and I was being pulled into its center, into the very heart of whatever dark thing had taken hold of this place. The door that had opened, the door that had been waiting for me. I had to know what was behind it. I had to see it, even if it destroyed me. With a trembling hand, I reached forward. The door handle was icy, slick with condensation, and I hesitated for just a moment before I twisted it. The creak of the door as it opened sounded like a scream in the quiet, echoing through the room like a warning. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped inside. The room was small, cramped, and the walls were lined with shadows that didn't quite belong. There was no light in here, nothing but the oppressive darkness. But I could see things that shouldn't have been there, things that didn't belong in the world of the living. A single bed sat in the center of the room, its sheets tattered and stained with what looked like old blood. But it wasn't the bed that made my stomach turn, it was the figure sitting on it. A figure I recognized. It was one of the patients. Someone I had seen on the ward before. Someone I had taken care of. But now, they were sitting there, staring straight ahead with eyes that were wide open, unblinking, as though they were frozen in place. Their mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was as though their voice had been stolen, as though they had been trapped here, unable to speak, unable to move. I took a step closer, my heart racing, but something stopped me. Something in the air shifted, and I felt an overwhelming presence behind me, as though the room itself had grown darker, colder, and more suffocating. "Don't," the reflection whispered. "You shouldn't have come in here. You can't unsee it." I turned around, and for the first time since I had stepped into the room, I felt the full weight of the thing that had been watching me. It wasn't Mary anymore. It was a twisted version of her, or maybe it was something else entirely. I couldn't tell anymore. All I knew was that it was the source of everything, the shadow that hung over the ward, the thing that had been waiting for me to find it. Its smile widened, stretching impossibly wide, and its eyes, those black, empty eyes, seemed to absorb everything in their path. The hum in the room grew louder, a pulsating sound that seemed to throb in my chest, matching the beat of my heart. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a force, a pressure that pushed down on me, on my very soul. "You should have left when you had the chance," it whispered. "Now, you're here forever." I could feel my knees weaken, my body starting to give way under the pressure. The walls around me seemed to stretch, bending like they were alive, closing in on me. I could hear the faintest sound of footsteps, distant but growing louder, and then the door slammed shut behind me. It was locked, trapped. I was trapped in this place, in this nightmare, and there was no escape. But then, a different sound reached my ears, an almost inaudible noise, a scratching sound, like nails against the floor. It was coming from the patient on the bed, the one who had been sitting so still, so lifeless. They were moving, slowly, deliberately, as if they were struggling to free themselves from something unseen, something that held them in place. Their hand reached out toward me, fingers curling like they were begging for help, but there was nothing I could do. The reflection in the corner of my eye was watching me, its smile still there, unchanging, mocking me. "Do you want to help them?" it whispered, its voice so soft, so seductive. "You can. You have the power. You know what you need to do." I shook my head, trying to clear the fog in my mind. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix this. All I knew was that I was standing in the middle of something I couldn't understand, something I couldn't control. The scratching sound grew louder. The patient on the bed was no longer just reaching out, they were crawling toward me, dragging themselves along the floor with an unnatural speed, their body twisting and contorting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I stepped back, my heart racing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the closer they got, the more I realized that this wasn't just a patient. This wasn't just someone I could help. There was something else, something twisted, something that had been taken over. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that if I didn't get out of this room, I would become just like them. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I ran as fast as I could, but it didn't matter. No matter how fast I moved, the darkness seemed to chase me, wrapping itself around me like a suffocating cloak. The walls were closing in, the air was thick, and I could still hear that low, insidious hum, like the building itself was alive, breathing in time with me. I reached the door, but it wouldn't open. I twisted the handle, pulled, shoved, but nothing happened. It was locked from the outside, as though someone had planned for me to be trapped in here. The scratching sound was getting closer, louder, and then just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door finally opened. I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I ran, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing louder than I wanted them to. Every part of my body screamed at me to keep moving, to escape whatever was following me, whatever was waiting just behind me in the shadows. The wards were silent, too silent. It was as if the whole building had become a giant tomb, holding its breath, waiting for something. I reached the nurse's station, but the familiar sight of the fluorescent lights overhead, the quiet hum of the computers, didn't bring comfort. It only made the unease crawl deeper under my skin. I looked around, expecting anyone to be there, but the station was empty. and the clock on the wall ticked, each second dragging on like a reminder of how late it was, how alone I felt. I pushed the button for the intercom. It crackled to life, but the voice that came through wasn't the reassuring tone of another nurse, ready to help. It was cold, distant. It was almost a hiss. "Are you ready?" it asked. My breath caught in my throat, the words slicing through my mind like a razor. I had no idea where it had come from. I didn't know who had spoken, but that voice, it wasn't just an echo in the building. It was the building, somehow, speaking to me, watching me. I slammed the intercom button, cutting the connection, but it didn't stop the sound in my head. The low hum that had started in Mary's room, the one I couldn't shake, was growing louder. The air was still heavy, as if something was pushing down on it from above, something that wanted to break through the ceiling and drag me back into the dark. I turned away from the station and made my way down the hallway. The door at the end of the corridor had always been locked. It was one of those places we kept out of, a hallway that didn't lead anywhere we needed to go. We called it the Forgotten Hall, a part of the ward that was sealed off, closed to both patients and staff. I had never been inside it, and I had never questioned why. But tonight, as I walked down the hallway toward it, I felt a strange pull, like invisible strings tugging at me, urging me to go through the door. There was no reason to go in, no reason to even think about it, but it didn't matter. Something inside me told me I had no choice. Something had opened the door, and now I had to walk through it. The door stood at the end of the hall, unassuming, like it had been there forever. The only thing different about it was the way it looked now, like it was inviting me. The handle was cold to the touch, almost like it had been waiting for my hand. The second I gripped it, I felt the hum, the low sound vibrating beneath the floorboards, the air thickening again, closing in. I opened it. The room beyond wasn't like anything I had ever seen. It wasn't an office, a storage closet, or a utility room. It wasn't anything that belonged in this building. It was too vast. There was no sense of proportion, no walls, no dimensions that made sense. It felt like walking into a void, a place that existed outside of time, and in that emptiness, something waited. I could feel it before I saw a tarn, overwhelming presence that was too big for the space, too old, too powerful. It wasn't a being I could comprehend. It wasn't human. It was something ancient, something that had been here before the building had ever been built, and it was hungry. I felt my breath leave my chest, leaving me lightheaded, dizzy with fear. I took a step forward, then another, and the air grew colder. The walls were breathing. They exhaled when I stepped forward and inhaled when I stepped back. It wasn't a building anymore. It was a living thing, something that had drawn me in, pulled me into its web. The door slammed shut behind me, and I was alone. Alone with whatever was waiting in the dark. I looked around, trying to see anything in the blackness, but it was like the darkness was absorbing the light. Nothing I saw made sense. It was like I had stepped into a place that shouldn't exist, a place that was a gap in reality, a breach in the fabric of the world itself. And then I heard it. A low guttural growl, far too deep to come from anything human. It came from the farthest corner of the room, the corner where the shadows seemed to pulse and writhe. I froze, my blood running cold. The growl became louder, closer, like something was crawling toward me, dragging its weight across the floor. I stepped backward, but the walls seemed to close in around me. There was no escape, no way out. I was trapped in this room, this place. I reached for the door handle, but it was no longer there. The wall was smooth, impenetrable, as though the door had never existed. I slammed my fists against it, my body trembling with fear, but nothing happened. The growl was louder now, and I could feel the presence growing closer, pressing in on me. And then, the whispers started. At first, they were faint, a soft murmur like the wind through the trees, but then they grew louder and more frantic, until they filled the entire room, crawling beneath my skin. They were speaking in a language I couldn't understand, but I knew what they meant. It was asking for me. It was calling to me. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, trying to block out the words, trying to stop the invasion of my mind. But it was too late. It had already taken root. The darkness had crept into me, and now it was inside, whispering things I couldn't ignore. "You're here forever," it said. "We've been waiting for you." I opened my eyes, and there it was, standing before me in the darkness, Mary, but not the Mary I had known. This was something else. Her eyes were black, empty, voids that swallowed the light around her. Her face was twisted into an expression that was both familiar and alien, a mockery of the person I had cared for. Her lips parted in a smile, but it wasn't comforting. "You belong to us now," she said. The voice that came from her wasn't hers, it was the voice of the building, of whatever ancient thing had been waiting for me all along. I wanted to scream, to fight, to escape, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed, trapped in the space between fear and understanding. I understood now. I understood what this place was. It was a prison, not just for the patients, but for everyone who came in contact with it. It wasn't just the ward that held us. It was the building, the shadows, the very walls themselves. I was never meant to leave. I could feel my pulse in my throat, choking me with every breath. My hands trembled, but I couldn't move. Mary, or whatever she had become, stood before me, her twisted reflection of something I had known, something I had tried to help, and I could do nothing but watch. Her eyes, those black, empty voids, stared into mine, and I felt my very soul shrink away, like it was being pulled from my chest, down into the abyss that lay behind her. "You're afraid," she whispered, the words slithering into my mind. "Afraid of what you'll find. Afraid of what's waiting for you here." Her voice, if it could even be called, that was both Mary's and something else. Something older, something that had been buried deep beneath the foundation of this place. Something that had existed long before I ever walked through its doors. The walls around me groaned, a deep, vibrating sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the building. It was like the place was alive, breathing, pulsing with its own energy. The darkness pressed in, curling around me, tightening its grip, until I could barely feel my own body, barely feel anything but the overwhelming presence of the thing that was holding me. "You belong to us," Mary said again, her lips curving into a smile that wasn't hers. "Just like the others. Just like all the ones who came before you. You're part of the pattern now. You can't leave. You never will." I wanted to scream, to run, to fight back, but my body wouldn't obey. My legs were leaden, my mind a blur. It was as if the building itself had seeped into me, turning my very thoughts into whispers that echoed through the dark. "You've seen too much," she continued, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "You can't turn back. You can't walk away. Not now, not when you've felt it." I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind, trying to focus on anything other than the suffocating blackness that surrounded me. But there was nothing to grab onto, nothing that made sense. I was alone in a room that wasn't a room, in a place that wasn't a place, and there was no escape. Then the whispers came again, louder this time. 1,000 voices, all speaking at once, all saying the same thing. "You're one of us now." And then, for the first time, I understood. The truth crashed into me, and it was more terrifying than anything I had ever imagined. The ward, the patients, the building itself, it wasn't just a psychiatric facility. It was a trap, a place that drew people in, lured them with promises of care, of healing, only to trap them in its web. And once you were here, once you had crossed the threshold, you could never leave. Not really, not completely. I thought of the other patients, the ones who had passed through the ward over the years, the ones who had come and gone. They hadn't been cured. They hadn't been saved. They had been consumed, one by one, their minds twisted, their spirits broken. They had become part of the building, part of the dark that lived in its walls. And now, I was part of it too. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt something shift inside me. A part of me, the part that was still clinging to the surface, to the hope that maybe, just maybe, I could find a way out, was slipping away. I could feel it. I could feel the weight of the building settling deeper into my bones, spreading through me like a poison. I wanted to scream, to fight back. I wanted to break free, to run out of this nightmare. But I knew now that there was no running, no escaping. The ward had already claimed me, and as I stood there, frozen in the dark, I felt something else. Something even worse. I wasn't alone anymore. The other patients, the ones who had been part of the cycle before me, the ones who had disappeared, they were here. Their eyes empty, hollow, dead, watched me from the darkness, their faces flickering in and out of the shadows like memories that never quite let go. They whispered my name, calling to me, beckoning me to join them, to be a part of the pattern, to give in to the darkness that had been waiting for me. "You'll see," Mary's voice echoed through the room. "You'll understand soon enough. This place doesn't let go. It never does." I felt the weight of it, the weight of all the souls trapped in this place, the weight of all the things that had been waiting for me. And it was suffocating. I wanted to fight. I wanted to tear myself free. But it was too late. The darkness had already begun to take root inside me. It was part of me now, and there was no turning back. As I sank to my knees in the center of the room, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They filled my mind, drowned out all other thoughts, until there was nothing left but the sound of their voices. I could feel my grip on reality slipping, my thoughts unraveling, as the room around me seemed to collapse, folding in on itself, stretching further and further until there was nothing left but the dark. And then, just as I thought I would lose myself entirely, I heard it. A sound faint at first, but growing louder. It was the door that had opened earlier. It was closing. I wasn't alone anymore. The other patients, the ones who had been part of the cycle before me, were stepping into the room. They were watching me, their eyes wide, their faces twisted in silent agony. And in that moment, I understood. I wasn't meant to survive. I was never meant to leave. I was just another piece of the puzzle, another soul claimed by the ward, another piece of its dark, twisted history. I was never going to get out. None of us were. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the world, trying to shut out the voices, the whispers, but they were everywhere now, in my mind, in my soul. They were part of me, and I knew then that I would never forget. Not the hum, not the whispers, not the cold that had seeped into my bones. I would never forget the pattern, the door that closed behind me, the faces of those who had come before me. And I would never forget the building, the ward. It remembered me, and it would never let me go. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Every comment adds a new shadow to our haunted corner of the internet. Share this if you know someone who enjoys a good scare. More spine-chilling stories are coming soon, and remember, the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to you. Thanks for watching if you dare.